They went to the Jordan and began to cut down trees. As one of them was cutting down a tree, the iron axe head fell into the water. "Oh no, my lord," he cried out. "It was borrowed." Okay, I've just lost my dad's axe head. Oh no. All right, the man of God asked, "Where did it fall?" When he showed him the place, Elisha cut a stick and threw it there and made the iron float. "Lift it out," he said. Then the man reached out his hand and took it. I've got some fishing lures I wish I could have done that with.
Right. You know, there's another story about a preacher getting swallowed by a fish. In Jonah 1:17, it says, "Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights." It goes on in chapter 2. And it says, "The Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land."
There's some ministers that I think people might want that to happen to,
Right.
but
I can just see him in there with a little campfire.
right, exactly. You got any more?
Yeah. What do we talk about? The valley of the shadow of death. I've been to several funerals, and they talk about this valley, and somehow sheep are walking around, and but you're not scared. Nobody's scared, but there's this valley. And in Psalms 23:4, it says, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, and thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me."
Right, that's like a Lord of the Rings
Lord of
scene
the
right
Rings,
there.
right? You got this super staff.
Right, exactly.
You're not scared.
Right. So these stories these all come from the Bible. And if I told you these stories from anywhere else, if I came to you and I told you, "I've got a story to tell you," and I told you one of these stories, you would not believe me. Okay, you would not believe that an axe head floated, that a donkey talked, that a fish ate a guy. You would not. Those are unbelievable things. But these stories in the Bible, when we read them this way, we have to understand that the Bible is not a collection of fables and fairy tales. These are not fictional stories made up to teach us a lesson. These are true stories that happened in a book that exists to teach us about the character and nature of God. And so let's look at what the Bible is real quick for just a minute. So it's really an incredible book, and it's more a collection of books than it is just one book. So our Bible that we have, if you look at it, it's a collection of 66 different books split up into the Old Testament and the New Testament. Those are all time-based. Okay? It was written over a period of about 1500 years. All right? So from the when the first thing was written to the last thing, that's a period of them being actually written. Now, it covers more time than that, but when they were actually written down is about 1500 years. There's about 40 different authors of those books in the Bible. Okay. And then the books in the Bible that we have today, they went through a process early on called canonization. So the early church got together and they all got to talking, and they basically decided, they didn't decide, but God led them to the place of what books are we using in our church, what books are inspired by God, and what books do we want to make sure get passed on to future generations. And there were some books that they ruled out, and there were these 66 that we have. There was a great deal of consensus and agreement that these books are inspired by God and useful for the life of the church. And so that's what we have today. We have these 66 books of the Bible that we have, and we know that they are true and they tell us about God. So you're going to talk a little bit more about that valley of the shadow of death thing, and tell us exactly just how real that is.
Right. And when you read the Bible, it's all about context. And you have to, when you look at the Bible, you have to think about what is the context that this was written about, and really what is this story about, or what is the meaning of this story. And like Eli said, when you read the Bible, you ask, what is God trying to tell me? What is it about the character of God that this story or that this book is leading me to breathe? So the way you read the Bible, the context that you read it in, or the frame of mind, if you will, that you read it in, is just critical. Can we get one of the slides up?
Yeah, that first picture.
Here we go. Now here's the valley of the shadow of death. Now this is the old Jerusalem. And again, we were singing about it this morning. It said, "We're the light of the world, the city on the hill." That's the city on the hill. Now this was taken off of Google Earth. I taught a Sunday school class about a year ago, and we were looking at some different things. And I noticed one of the things that the people in the Sunday school class was, as soon as I'd say something, they'd pull their phones out and start pulling it up on Google or whatever. And it really dawned on me during that lesson is really Google Earth and modern day pictures really seem a powerful message to people, and people can kind of buy in if they see it. Well, this is a Google Earth shot. Here's the rock, the dome on the rock, the Muslim mosque that's in the temple area still today. This is the Kidron Valley. There's two valleys, really, major valleys that Jerusalem sits on, the Hinnom Valley and the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley is, and this is a cemetery. This is a cemetery. You can walk right now, Ladon Street, coming out of Jerusalem, go through the Lion's Gate, and walk about 10 minutes, and you're in the Kidron Valley. Now up here we'll see it a little bit. Over here is the Mount of Olives, Gethsemane, and the Mount of Olives. This right here is the Hinnom Valley. Now the Hinnom Valley is the valley of the shadow of death, and you can see how dark it is. You see how dark this valley is. And what would happen is back when in the pagan days, the pagans would kill their children, and they would worship a god called Malik. And what they would do is they would sacrifice their children, sometimes burn them alive, sometimes sacrifice them, and then throw them into the pit. And they put all kinds of bodies and dead animals and humans and all kinds of waste in that valley. And they'd also throw, like we do today, refrigerators, mattresses, those kind of things in there as well. But this was full of a bunch of contamination. And they started fires. As it built up over hundreds of years, they started to control the volume. They would actually start fires. And this would smoke and burn, and it would stink. But the Jewish people, of course, as you're familiar with Jewish people, they do not like anything that's unclean. So this Hinnom Valley was considered a very dark, a very dangerous, a very unsanitary, a very stinky, smoky, dark space. Now, this is a deep canyon. You can see how dark it is, even in this picture, how dark it is. Well, a couple of things happen. One of the phenomena is that when it would rain, the water would flow down the mountain and run down this Hinnom Valley. Mustard seeds love contaminated soil and contaminated water. So as you can see, these are groves of mustard seed trees. So as the water would come through, it would water those mustard seeds, and they would grow trees in this Hinnom Valley. Now, when the Israelites came back from the captivity of Babylon, they came back in, but they had stopped throwing bodies, and they had stopped the sacrifices, and they had stopped a lot of that, but they still put dead animals, they still put trash, they still put it was still their dump. And so again, even after the Israelites came back from captivity, the rain would come down and they would grow mustard seeds in that. And if you look through the Bible, there's a lot of references to mustard seeds. And it talks about the faith of a mustard seed and how, a farmer will plant a mustard seed and water it and it'll turn into a huge trees that the birds are out in. I mean, I challenge you to go home and look at the mustard seeds. And that's where a lot of that reference comes from. I mean, this is about a 37-acre period. And again, as Eli was talking about, this is the world history and the world Bible pretty much took place. I mean, you've got the Olive Garden over there. You've got the temple that was destroyed several times. This is where Abraham would have sacrificed Cain, or almost did, right here in this area. Right there on the Kidron Valley is where that would have taken place.
Next
so
picture.
You can go from Genesis,
That next picture, we can show that.
This is how it's laid out. You can see the Mount of Olives, Mount Scopius, which is the highest part of that thing, Mount Zion, which is where the temple is, and where the temple was, and that's the Dome of the Rock. This is the Western Hill. Now, this is where Herod would have had his palace. Would have been over here on the Western Gate. In fact, the gate coming out of the palace, the temple, would have been Herod's Western Gate. So Herod would have had his palace right up here on this hill, and you can see it was one of the highest spots. I can just picture Jesus when he's telling this in Matthew, when he talks about the mustard seed. And it says, if you'd have a faith of a mustard seed, you could move this mountain. Let's go back to that picture. Yeah. So I can see Jesus hanging out down here, maybe the Mountain of Olives. And he's talking to the people, and he said, if you had faith like these mustard seeds down here, and like faith grows in the worst of circumstances, right? You go back and you look at, when did my faith grow the worst? It was under the worst of circumstances. It was when you had death, and when you had triage, when you had damage, and when you had troubles, and when you had all the stuff going on in your life, just like the Hinnom Valley, the faith would grow. So I can see Jesus sitting up there saying, if you had faith like that much, if your faith would grow during these hard times, then you could move that mountain. I can see him pointing right over to Herod. Herod's trying to kill him when he was a baby. He's getting ready to go stand trial in front of Herod. He's pointing at Herod and saying, you could move his heart. If you had just a little bit of faith, then God could use that little bit of faith to do powerful things, like move Herod's heart. He's not talking about moving a mountain in Colorado. You know, when I was a kid, I'd go on CIY, I'd go to a youth trip, we'd go to Colorado, and I'd read that scripture. You know, it's like if I had any faith, I could say move mountain and it would move. And I'd say move Rocky Mountain and it wouldn't move. And it's like, I must have no faith. That is not the context. You've got to realize that when God says you can move a mountain, he's not talking about moving the Rocky Mountains. He could have been talking about moving the heart of Herod. Do you see what I'm saying? So when you read the Bible, the context that you read it in is just critically important. It's literal and it's true, but the context that's what it says when the Bible says it's alive. It's a living, breathing, changing document. The person that it is about is still alive, right? It's about God. God is still very much alive. So it's not like a history book of who God was. It's a present day history. It's a present day book about who God is. So when you read the Bible, it's not about a history book. It's not a science book. It's not a book of what has happened in the past. It's a book about what is going on today.
Absolutely. So you've got actual places in scripture that, it's talking about actual places that we can still see and visit today. And you can go see where things happen in history. There's some other examples of how reliable scripture is. And I want to share a few of those from you. And when academics get together and they try and figure out, is this book reliable? Or they might say, what's the historicity of this book? That's a fancy word for saying, how true is this book? How real is this book? And they test a couple of things. And there's three things that they look at. Okay. And the first thing is how close are the copies that we have to the original event, to the original document. Okay. And so how close are the documents we have to the original document? How many of them are there? Is there one or are there thousands? Okay. And then how similar are they as they go throughout time? All right. And so when we look at those tests for the Bible, it shows a few things. First of all, the documents related to the Bible, we have lots of fragments of biblical documents, more than any other book in history. And those documents, those fragments that we have of the Bible, sometimes start within 100 years of the original event. All right, that sounds like a long time until you start comparing it to other historical documents. So some of the biblical documents are within 100 years. Other historical books, most of them are 500 to 1500 years after the original document. So no one thought it important to write that down for 500 to 1500 years. All right. So that's one way that the Bible shows its reliability. Another way is how many of them are there? And when you talk about this measurement, the one document that always comes up is Homer's The Iliad. Very important, piece of historical literature and one of the best documented historical books in history. To date, because they're always finding new things, to date, there are 1,800 plus fragments of Homer's The Iliad. All right, that's a huge number. It really verifies what Homer actually wrote in the Iliad. To give you a comparison, that's the greatest number we have of any other historical document. The Bible, okay, biblical fragments, there are over 66,300 biblical fragments. Some of these are words and single verses. Some of them are full books that have been found. All right, so there's tons of evidence that the Bible was written and is what it is. Okay, the other thing is how similar are these things? The fragments that we have of the Bible are strikingly similar to what has come before them. There is very little variation when they find a new piece of the Gospel of Mark or a new copy of Isaiah. There is very little difference in that copy they find and the copies they already have. The Bible was consistently retold for thousands and thousands of years because the stories were so important to the people telling them. Most of the differences they find are simply stylistic differences or a simple transcription error. All right? It's because my handwriting was different than the other guy's handwriting, and those create a little bit of variance there. But the Bible has an amazing amount of consistent retelling. It's well documented. And then the last thing that it has is there is tons of archaeological evidence for the things that happened in the Bible. The valley of the shadow of death that he talked about is just one example. And Greg's going to talk a little bit more about some of the other things that are archaeologically accurate. I just want to share one quote before he gets into that. And it says this, and you can put it up there on the screen. It says, "It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. No archaeological discovery has ever disagreed with a biblical reference. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or exact detail historical statements in the Bible. And by the same token, proper evaluation of biblical description has often led to amazing discoveries." Okay, this is Nelson Glueck. He's former president of Hebrew Union College, so he knows a thing or two about that area in archaeology. And you'll see in what Greg's going to share just how true this statement is.
Yeah, Eli asked me, do a little piece on archaeology. Look at kind of the archaeology that proves the Bible. And about a year ago, I was teaching a Sunday school class, and we got into some of that. We started looking at some of the archaeology stuff. And when I did that class, I challenged myself: don't use any article or any publication that's more than 4 months old. Don't use any archaeological find in Israel that's more than 4 months old, was what I did when I taught the Sunday school class. So I kind of did that when I prepared this morning. I went back and kind of looked at what has happened since 2020. And, last year, 2019, there was about 424 archaeological license that was issued by the IAA. And IAA is like Israel's Archaeological Association or whatever it is. But it's the government function, the government division of the government that really controls all the archaeological licenses and digs. I mean, there's probably 500 or 600 archaeological digs that have started since 2020 over the last 10 months. And really probably over the last 6 months, because it takes a little bit of time to get all that published. I was telling Eli earlier, when you talk about finding an artifact in Israel, that's like finding a paper cup at the state fair. In fact, the archaeological licenses, nearly 80% of all the archaeological licenses that were issued this year were issued what they call with salvage fines, salvage recovery licenses. And essentially what that is an architect walking in front of a bulldozer picking up stuff as they come to it. That's essentially what a salvage find is, because the artifacts are just deep. I mean, you think about it. The temple has been destroyed several times, right over a couple thousand years by enemies. So the enemies would come in, they'd burn it, build it, destroy it, and then they'd come back, build it again. Somebody else would come in, destroy it, burn it, build it again. Another enemy would come in, destroy it, burn it, build it again. So that entire country, that entire 37 acres of property has had 2,000 or 3,000 years of reconstruction, if you can imagine that. Like I worked at a prison one time, and we were digging a pipe, and we hit a piece of concrete, and somebody said, "What is that concrete?" And it's like, "Well, there used to be a tennis court here." And it's like, who would put a tennis court here? I'm sure. Can you imagine what Israel is like and what Jerusalem is like? Every time they put something in the ground, they find some stuff. I mean, the other day they were actually building a road. They found a bag of golden coins. And it's like, okay, what are those? Some Caesar coins. Okay, throw them in the truck. Let's go. I'm telling you, it's crazy when you read that. I challenge you, go home and Google archaeological finds in Jerusalem or Israel in 2020, and you better get ready for some reading. I mean, these articles are 30 pages long about all kinds of crazy stuff, magnificent stuff that they're finding. They'll find 300 to 400 significant biblical artifacts every day since the beginning of 2020. Every day. The way they spent $122 million on archaeological digs in Jerusalem already this year. And how they fund that is these construction groups. The population of Israel right now is $9.5 million. In 2065, it's expected to be over 20 million people. So the population of Israel will double in the next 40 years, if you can imagine that. It will be the most densely populated place on earth. So there's a lot of construction going on. There's people that are wanting houses, roads, hospitals, buildings. The population of that city is getting ready to double. So the construction is just insane. I was telling Eli, we found a dinosaur bone out in western Oklahoma one time at the prison. And I'm telling you, it shut down the prison for about 2 years while a bunch of architects came in with paintbrushes digging with a paintbrush. And it's like, come on, guys, we got a place, we got stuff to do. We don't need this. Same thing in Israel. Same thing in Jerusalem. They've got archaeological, every time they want to build a road, which is continual. Do we have a picture of some of that? Yeah, here we go. Here's a road. Now, this building right here, that's 7,000 years old. That's a city that was found 7,000 years. They consider it 7,000 years old. They just uncovered building a road. So the archaeological finds in that area is just unbelievable. And it's not like, oh, look at what we found. They've got a Bible on site. On almost every site, they have a Bible, and they use the Bible to figure out what it is. So it's like they come across this thing, and it's like, what is this? Well, it's a threshing floor. It looks like an altar. This must be, well, David come and built his altar and thresh. And it's like, that's not where that's at. That's just right over here. It's like, what do you mean it's over here? He said, don't you remember, like 1,000 years after David, they came in, remodeled the kitchen, and moved some stuff around? That's what we're talking about. It's not like, oh my gosh, look at this. We found David's altar. Everybody expected to find it. It's not like a surprise that they find these things. I mean, that's what I always thought about. Before I really got into this thing, it's like they need to dig over there and see if they can find, the temple or the alt or the grave or the place where Jesus was crucified. People don't find that stuff and aren't surprised. No, they're not surprised when they find that stuff. They can explain where it come from and how many times it's been moved, and they know exactly where that stuff is at. So really, when you start thinking about what's the archaeological proof of the Bible, go to Israel. They said, I read an article that said even the atheists that live in Jerusalem do not doubt the existence of Abraham and David and Jesus. So again, archaeology in Jerusalem is not trying to prove the existence of the Bible. The Bible is used to validate the things that they find every day.
Right. Like I said, like we said earlier, it's truly an amazing book. And when we begin to wrestle with it for what it is, even all these unbelievable stories, we have to wrestle with them as truth. And sometimes I think what gets us tripped up is the way in which we approach the Bible. And so there's a couple of ways in which we approach the Bible. I think one of them is incorrect and one of them is correct. So I want to share a couple of questions, and this is often what we do. So the first question, this is the wrong question to ask when you sit down to read the Bible. The wrong question is, what does the Bible say about me? Okay, when you sit down to read the Bible, that's the wrong question. The right question to ask is, what does the Bible say about God? Okay, that's what this book is about. It's about the God who created the universe and who is still living and active, like we've talked about. And if we look at that story of Balaam's donkey, where you've got the talking donkey, we could go on for days about a guy talking to a donkey because there's a lot of parallels there, guys. So I won't get into that. But when we ask the wrong question of that story, when we ask, what does the Bible say about me? We can get discouraged and frustrated with God because he's not using our donkey to talk to us. Okay. He's not using our domesticated pets to talk to us. But when we sit down and we ask the right question about that story, what does the Bible say about God? We see in that story that we serve a God who is not bound by the laws of nature. He's beyond the laws of nature, and that he's willing to step outside of the believable to communicate with us. Okay, that's what we can learn from that story, is that he's willing to do incredible things to communicate with us if we will just simply stop worrying about the donkey misbehaving and listen to what God has to say to us. And so when we approach the Bible from the wrong perspective, okay, from kind of a self-centered perspective, we miss a lot of what's in the Bible, because this is a book about God, all right, and he's the main character, and it's teaching us how to relate to him. Okay, we can learn a lot about ourselves, but we also, the main thing we learn is, how do we relate to this God
I
that the
love the
Bible's
story about
about?
the axe head floating. And I find myself relating to that story a lot. Probably a month or so ago, I probably wasn't that long. The pump at my swim pool went out. I know that's a catastrophe, right, for everybody. But at my house, a non-working swimming pool pump is a huge problem. So we'd gone out, and it's a pretty new pump. We'd gone out and we'd drained it, and we had backfilled it, and we had primed it, and we had flipped all the stuff on it, and reprogrammed the computer, and we had jacked with this thing for 2 or 3 days. It wouldn't come on. And the non-working pump is a problem, especially when you got 9 grandkids that like to come over about every day and swim. One morning, it was a Saturday morning, I'm in the in the den studying, and I hear Karen come in. She'll say, "You'll never believe what happened," and I knew immediately. I knew immediately what had happened. She said, "I prayed over that swim pool pump, and I just said, God, you've got to get this pump to work." And she said, "I flipped the switch on, boom, that thing fired up. God answered my prayer." And I thought, just like the floating axe head, I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, God really cares about you. God really cares about these little problems that you have. God wants a relationship with you and wants to answer your prayers. He wants to bless you like you just can't imagine. So when things like that happen, there's a lot of, there's a lot of ways I could explain that. It's like, oh, okay, it must have been a short, and had some wind last night, and they fixed this little short that was in there, but it probably won't work much longer. It never did quit again. It never quit again. It worked all summer, never quit again. The other day, I get out of my car, shut my car door, and as soon as I shut it, I thought, dadgummit, I locked my keys in the car. And that is a pain. You guys do that? Lock your stinking keys in the car? Push the button, lock the doors, shut the door, boom, my keys are locked in the car. I just said, God, I cannot put up with this today. Please help me get those keys out. I walk around to the passenger side, open the door, reach over there and pull the keys out. That could not happen. That could not have happened. But again, axe heads don't float. Pumps don't just miraculously come on. I mean, when I read that story about the axe head, I think about how God answers my little prayers and cares about the little stupid stuff that I do that he can fix. So again, I think it's all about context. It's all about how you read it. It's like, what is this story talking to me, and how does this relate to my life today? And it's just incredible how accurate and how precise it is.
Absolutely. And so, hopefully, today and what we've talked about, you've learned a little bit about the truly reliable nature of the Bible and some of the amazing things that are in there. And I know it's hard. I know it's hard sometimes to believe some of the stories in the Bible because they truly are miraculous. They're outside of our understanding. But when you approach it as true, it really is a life changing book.
As I started thinking about some of this stuff today, I thought, well, how does this relate to people in everyday life? And I think about the donkey, the Balaam's talking donkey, and it's like, what is that telling me? And it's like, the part that just kept sticking out is that the servant of the Lord was standing in the road with his sword drawn. So it's like God had sent him to stop an action. He didn't send him with a fluorescent orange vest and a sign that said slow down and stop. No, he sent a warrior with a sword. He's busy. I mean, he sent a warrior down to do his work, because being a Christian and following and being in God's work and being a servant of God is a warrior. It's fighting. You go back and you look at the axe head, the floating axe head. And it wasn't, in my mind, it's like, oh, I've dropped my axe, dadgummit. And Elijah walks over and says, yeah, I appreciate you volunteering this morning. I see you got a little blister coming up. Why don't you go on back to town? I'll get you a new axe head and we can start over tomorrow. That's not what happened. No, he said, I lost my axe head. I borrowed it. I came out here to do God's work and I've lost my tool. And what happens? He throws a stick in the water. And I was thinking, why would he throw a stick in the water? Well, if you're thinking that, you've missed the point. The stick was another axe handle. He throws an axe handle in and says, float it up, put it back on, let's get back to work. I mean, like Michael said a few weeks ago, you got to fight. You got to continue to fight. God says, put on the armor of God, and that's a helmet and a sword. And he wants us to fight. He wants us to fight through the struggles. Being a Christian like the mustard seed, never in the wildest dreams can I imagine that God is saying, just throw a little seed on it, walk off, I'll grow you a tree. That's not what that's about. That's not what those scriptures are about. That's like throw a seed on there and then get to work. Stay hard. You're going to have some troubles. Being a Christian is not easy. Your marriage is not easy. Having a marriage problem, it's not like, okay, I went to counseling, it didn't work, I guess I'm done. No. Put the axe head back on and get to work. Draw a sword. Fight. I'm drunk again. I just regressed. I fell off the wagon. Here I am drinking again. I guess it didn't work. No, God. It's not that God didn't work. It's like draw a sword. Get to work. Put the axe head back on. Let the contamination and let the troubles in your life grow your faith.
Absolutely. So we're gonna wrap up here. The band's gonna come back up and sing, and we just want to throw out a few things and challenge you. Some of you have never engaged the Bible and entered into a relationship with the God that the Bible is about. You may have read the Bible time after time after time, but you've never entered a relationship with the God of the Bible, who does miraculous things, who sends angels to fight for you, who gives you the faith of a mustard seed, even in the contaminated soil of life. And we can do that today. We've got the baptismals ready. We got shorts and t-shirts. If you want to make that decision today, we'll have an elder up front. You can talk to them. We can show you how to do that. And then for some of you, you need to go back and engage the Bible from the perspective of, what does this tell me about God? What does this teach me about God? For too many of us, we've been reading the Bible through the lens of ourselves. And so we need to step back and we need to read the Bible from the perspective of, what does this tell me about the God of the Bible, about the person who this book is about, and let His Spirit lead us and speak to us when we read that book. And when we read these amazing stories, don't just write them off as, oh, that's fantastical. That doesn't happen anymore. It happens every day. We just have to pay attention a little bit more so that we can see those, and we have to understand the God of the Bible to see those things. So we're going to sing a song here this morning. Anything else that you want to add? Okay, so we're going to sing a song this morning. If you will stand with us, we'll sing, and then we'll be done this morning.
You are beautiful beyond description, too marvelous for words, too wonderful for comprehension, like nothing ever seen or heard.